ask you, maybe in your lifetime, have you noticed the difference, the shift in the culture now, that if you will not get on board, if you'll not say what they want you to say, if you'll not do what they want you to do, the kind of mentality now is get on board or we'll run over you, right? Never has the mob mentality been so strong, I don't think, not at least not in American life. The mentality has become, if you will not give us what we want, if you won't say what we want to hear, we will make sure you lose everything. And it leaves people terrified. It leaves people terrified to speak the truth. It leaves people terrified to take a stand against all the crazy things that are going on in our culture around us. The idea basically is, if you will not do what we want, we will erase you from society. We are going to make you pay. We've come to call this cancel culture. Literally, if you won't do what we want, we'll just cancel you. We'll literally erase you like you never existed. We'll take your job, we'll take your family, we'll take your livelihood, we'll take everything if you won't get on board. It seems kind of new to us. It seems like in the last maybe 10 years or so this has become a problem. But really, I want you to see something this morning, and that is that cancel culture isn't new. Cancel culture is really just peer pressure on steroids. Someone needs to ask the question, especially right now when we live in a world where literally men who are born men can say they're women and everybody has to agree. Even if it makes no sense, even if biologically it's untrue, we're living in a world now where if you don't shake your head and say that's true, well, you're the problem, right? And what I find so interesting is everybody wants so desperately to be on the right side. A lot of people never stop and ask, well, what is the right side? Right? The question should be, somebody needs to ask the question, what if the crowd's wrong? Especially, what if the crowd is wrong in regard to things that have eternal consequences? You know, the reality is now, it's not being said directly, but it's been said subliminally. The reality is now, there is a mob of people that is right now crying out, crucify Jesus. And not in the sense of literally nailing his body to a cross, but there is an undercurrent, a group of people that want to do away with any trace of God in the society. And it's so easy to get caught up in this shifting culture. It's so easy to get caught up in the wave that nobody stops to ask, wait a minute though, what if God's real? What if there is such a thing as eternity? What if Christ is actually the Son of God? What if the decisions we are making have eternal consequences? I want to look at an event in Scripture this morning where I think the fear of one man and his fear literally of being canceled forced him to do something that's unimaginable, something that's unthinkable, and that was have an innocent man murdered. Now, we're going to pick up right where we left off last week. Remember, Jesus was arrested in the garden. He was taken to the house of Caiaphas to stand trial before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was composed of about 70 Jewish elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the priests, the chief priests. 70 men composed this court, if you will. It was essentially the high court. It was the supreme court of Israel. Jesus was taken to Caiaphas' house, and obviously from the beginning the trial was a sham. They didn't really want to know whether Jesus was innocent or guilty because before the trial even began, they had already decided that they would put him to death. So basically, this was a court looking for a crime, if you will. They were a jury looking for a crime, not a jury there to try a crime. In essence, before the trial of Jesus ever started, the sentence had already been declared, the verdict had already been made. Literally, the sentence preceded the charges in this case. But this little detail, this little injustice didn't sway them from their mission. The Sanhedrin was so determined to take Jesus' life, they would do anything necessary to shut him up. However, they ran into this one little problem. When they started to try Jesus, they couldn't find any witnesses against him whose stories agreed. So witnesses started to say, well, I saw him do this, or I heard him say this. But the witnesses couldn't agree with each other because they were lying. But this Sanhedrin, they didn't let this insignificant detail like the lack of evidence. That's just an insignificant detail. They didn't let that derail them. They condemned Jesus Christ to death, and what they condemned him for was telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Still, the Sanhedrin had one major problem. One of the high priests actually looked at Jesus and basically asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" And when Jesus responded, "I am," he was essentially taking on the name, the divine name, the covenant name, Old Testament name of God. When he said, "I am," they all gasped. They couldn't believe Jesus had actually said to them, "Yes, I am the Son of God." And they all began to say, "Look, we don't need any more evidence. This is enough reason to crucify him." But they had one major problem. Under Roman law, the Sanhedrin did not have the authority to execute anyone. Capital punishment was reserved for the highest leaders, the highest Roman officials. So this is where we basically pick up our story in the text where we left off last week in Luke chapter 23, verse number 1. So because they could not execute, because they could not crucify Jesus, verse 1 says, "Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate." Now you've heard the name Pilate. If you've been in church at any point in life, you've heard the name Pilate. But who was he? Pilate was the highest Roman official basically in the region. He was the governor, the prefect of the Roman province of Judea. He had been appointed the governor by Tiberius Caesar. The reason basically that he was appointed the governor was because his mentor, Sejanus was the commander of the imperial, the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was a close friend of Tiberius, a close advisor of Tiberius, and I could essentially say Sejanus got Pilate the gig. He got him hired. Due to his influence, he was able to secure Pilate this appointment. Now, historians, when you read about Pilate, they paint him as a cruel tyrant. They paint him as an extremely violent man. I could say this, Pilate was a harsh anti-Semite. He hated Jews. He despised them. He despised the people he was appointed to govern, and he and the Jews had multiple clashes already. Pilate did not mind offending the Jews. In fact, I think it seems like Pilate thrived on offending the Jews. He was often accused by the Jews of being cruel and unjust. In fact, it had even gotten back to Tiberius at times that he was an unfit ruler. But since Sejanus, his mentor, had his back, since Sejanus was over the imperial guard, since Sejanus was there to whisper in Tiberius' ear, literally Pilate could get away with anything. He had someone in the court who had his back. Now his palace was in Caesarea. That's where he actually ruled from. But he just happened to be in Jerusalem at this time because he was there to oversee the troops in case a riot broke out during the feast. So let's return to the text. You've got a little idea of who Pilate is. Return to the text now. Let's set the scene. It's early in the morning, probably 5 or 6 a.m. Maybe it's even before sunrise. I don't even know if Pilate is out of bed yet, but a mob of at least 70 men, and probably many more because this probably included servants and other people, a mob of at least 70 men come marching up to Pilate's palace. Caiaphas is leading them. And they've got one man with them, and this one man, the whole mob is surrounding this one man. Now, I don't know if they woke Pilate up. I don't know if Pilate was already awake or what happened, but you can imagine a guard coming to Pilate and saying, "Sir, there's a mob outside." Now, this was what Pilate was afraid of. The last thing he wanted was a mob to rise up, for these Jews to rise up and try to overthrow Rome or have some kind of revolt. So he gets the message, there's a mob outside. In the mob's possession, there's one man, and they're bringing him to stand before you. Think about at this point, Jesus, he's been beaten at this point, so he's probably bleeding. Jesus was absolutely exhausted. He's probably dehydrated. He stood trial literally all night long hearing their accusations. He's been beaten. He's bloody. I mean, he's a weak mess at this point. And they bring Jesus to Pilate, but they get to the praetorium, they get to the palace, if you will, and they won't go inside because the Jews were so concerned if they went inside, they would defile themselves and not be able to eat the Passover. It's so funny how religion is so concerned about appearance. Religion is so concerned about outward rituals, but not so much with actual justice. Here they're trying to have an innocent man killed, and they're not really worried about that, but they don't want to step foot in a Gentile's house lest it make them unable to eat the feast. So Jesus is taken inside. Maybe Pilate woke up, maybe they woke him up. Either way, he comes out to the crowd. And he asked them, John tells in John 18:29, Pilate asked the crowd, what accusation do you bring against this man? Why are you here? Well, the Jews kind of answered in a tit-for-tat way. They said, if he were not an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you. Basically, they're saying back to Pilate, we wouldn't be here if there wasn't something wrong with him. Let's pick up our reading in verse number 2. They began, the Sanhedrin, the Jews, they began to accuse Jesus, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." They knew that Pilate would have absolutely no interest in their Jewish arguments. In fact, if you read this, one of the other accounts in the Gospels, Pilate actually says to him, "You deal with this from your own law. Take him. This is none of my business. You take him and deal with him from your own law." They knew that Pilate wasn't interested in their Jewish problems, so they actually switched the charges here. Now remember, they have charged Jesus in front of the Sanhedrin with blasphemy, but when they come before Pilate, that's not the charge they bring before Pilate, because they know that's not something that's going to interest Pilate. Instead of blasphemy, the original charge, they tell Pilate basically, "This man, we have charged him with sedition. We've charged him with rebellion against Rome," because they knew that would pique Pilate's interest. "We found this man trying to raise up a revolt. We found this man saying, 'Don't pay taxes to Caesar.' We found this man saying, 'I'm a king.'" Now, you know that most of what they've just said wasn't true, especially the tax part. Jesus and Peter paid their taxes. In fact, when Jesus was asked about paying taxes, he said, "Render to Caesar that which is Caesar." So everything they've said is really just a lie. Well, Pilate goes into the praetorium. He takes Jesus and he begins to have a conversation with Jesus. Now Jesus has been accused of sedition. Jesus has basically been accused of trying to lead an insurrection, and Pilate can't just let this go, so he begins to interview Jesus. Verse 3. Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Jesus, are you who they say you are?" And verse 3 says, Jesus answered him and said, "It is as you say." Basically, Jesus here is saying, "You said it. You're right, I am." Now, John gives us a little more context, a little more full treatment of what Jesus actually said. John tells us that when Jesus answered Pilate, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I would not be delivered to the Jews. But now, my kingdom is not from here." Well, Pilate answered him after that and said, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I've come into the world." So Jesus explains to Pilate, yes, I'm a king, but not the kind of king you're thinking. I'm not here to stir up problems with Rome. I'm not here to establish an earthly kingdom at this moment. When Pilate heard him say this, the wheels starting to turn in his mind. He really understands, okay, this guy, this is Pilate's view, probably thinks, this guy might be crazy, but he's not a criminal. Right? He's not guilty of what they accused him of. So verse 4 says, he brings Jesus back out, and Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." Literally, it's like he's saying, look, he might be crazy. He might think he's a king of some spiritual realm, but look, I find no fault in him. He might be crazy, but he's not a criminal. Verse 5, when the Jews heard this, they were the more fierce. They were like a raging sea here. I mean, they began to froth at their mouth. They were so angry when Pilate says, he didn't do anything wrong. Verse 5, but they were more fierce, and they said, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now, that probably didn't mean a lot to you what they just said, but they said, he stirs up the people. He's trying to cause a riot, and he's been teaching everywhere he goes, and he did it in Judea, and he did it all the way from Galilee till he got here. Well, when they said Galilee, the light goes off in Pilate's mind. Because Galilee was really the epicenter of the rebellion against Rome. All the zealot leaders, all the factions seemed to originate in Galilee. So when they said this man's from Galilee, it kind of throws a switch in Pilate's mind. He's like, Galilee? Verse number 5. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man was a Galilean. We're a Galilean. Verse 7. As soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. So now Pilate knows, okay, if he's a Galilean, this might be a problem. But Pilate also sees a way out here, if you will. Herod Antipas. Herod was the son of Herod the Great. This is the Herod who has had John the Baptist beheaded. He's not a king either, but he's a ruler, a Roman appointed ruler, and he is over the region of Galilee. He just happened to be in town at this same time, and the light bulb goes off in Pilate's mind, because Pilate doesn't want to do anything with Jesus, but he thought, okay, I will send Jesus to Herod. I'll let Herod deal with this. This is actually a little deeper than just trying to get out of it, though, because up to this point, Pilate and Herod had been at odds. Maybe part of it was probably because they were both vying for power, right? One wanted to be greater than the other. Another part was probably that Pilate had actually massacred some of Herod's subjects. The Bible tells us in Luke chapter 13 that Pilate had mingled the blood of the Galilean sacrifices with their own blood. So literally that tells us that probably at some point Pilate had actually killed some Galileans as they were offering their sacrifices. So Herod already has a problem with Pilate. In fact, we know from history that at one point Herod specifically reported Pilate to Tiberius for a crime. So they're at odds with each other. They're at odds in a power struggle. They're at odds because Pilate has killed some of Herod's subjects, and they're at odds because Herod has reported Pilate to Tiberius. All that's going on. And then here stands Jesus right before Pilate, and Pilate thinks, here's how I'll fix it. I'll send Jesus as a peace offering to Herod. It's as if Pilate's saying here, I know I overstepped my bounds in the past, Herod, but this time I'm trying to get it right. He's a Galilean. He's one of your subjects. You were appointed to rule over the people of Galilee. You judge this. You take care of it. Now, he can't get the Jews off his back without making some decision regarding Jesus. He doesn't want them to riot if he says, I'm not going to punish him. So he thinks, okay, I'll pass this off to Herod. I'll let Herod take care of it. Rather than taking a stand, he just takes the easy way out and he sends them to Herod. Now, we're not going to look at it, but in the text, he arrives before Herod, and Herod had been wanting to meet Jesus for a long time because basically Herod wanted Jesus to do a magic trick. Herod wanted Jesus to entertain him, and you'll find this very interesting. Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus. Jesus never once answers Herod. If I'm not mistaken, Herod is the only person in the Bible that Jesus never spoke back to. Jesus never even responded to Herod. Literally, Jesus wouldn't even give Herod the time of day. Well, he tries to get him to do a trick. He won't do anything. He won't entertain him. So Herod and his soldiers, they mock Jesus. They beat him. They put on him an absolutely beautiful, gorgeous robe, and they worship him like he's the real king of Israel. But he actually hadn't committed a crime. So there wasn't really anything Herod could do. So Herod sent him back to Pilate. Verse 13. So Pilate then, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, so everybody comes back together, they come back to the praetorium, to the palace, to hear what Pilate has to say, and there's Jesus. He calls everybody together and he says to them, you've brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, so I questioned him, I asked him, I did this in your presence, I was the judge, I was the jury, but you were in the auditorium, you heard it all. He said, having examine him, I found no fault in this man concerning those things which you accuse him. In other words, he's not leading a sedition. He's not leading a rebellion. He might be crazy, but he's not a criminal. And then he says to support it, he said, look, this is not only my opinion. I sent him to Herod, verse 15. Neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. He said, therefore, I'm going to chastise him, and I'm going to release him. Now, I'll have him whipped, I'll have him beat for causing all this problem. I'll punish him, but then I'm going to let him go. Verse 17, it says it was necessary for him to release one of them at the feast. It was tradition at that time that to stir the goodwill of the people, that the ruler would release one prisoner to them, or whatever prisoner the people demanded, he would release one prisoner during Passover to kind of stir up goodwill between the two. And Pilate figures, well, Jesus is an obvious candidate because Jesus is very popular among the people. There's certainly some people that don't want Jesus to be crucified. So if I let Jesus go, it'll satisfy, it'll make everybody happy. I'll beat him, then I'll let him go. He didn't see any real reason to put him to death, but he did promise, I'll satisfy your bloodthirst. I'll punish him for causing this public disturbance, but then I'm going to let him go. Verse 18. When Pilate gets that out of his mouth, listen to this, verse 18, and they all, so you've got the crowd of 70, but the crowd has actually grown now because it's not only the chief priests and the rulers, it's now the people have been added. So there's a crowd here. By now it's about 9 o'clock in the morning. Now this is really interesting. Think about it. Jesus has been through basically 2 trials. He's on the 3rd trial at this point. He's been tried all night. These trials with Pilate and with Herod and now back before Pilate have only taken a few hours. You can't try someone in this short amount of time, but in just a few hours, Jesus has been tried. Now he's standing before Pilate again. The crowd has grown, and he says to him, I don't find any fault in this man. I'm not going to crucify him. I'm not going to put him to death. Well, when he said that, verse 18, they all cried out at once, the whole crowd, the whole mob. You have those palm branches in your hands. Just a couple days earlier, when Jesus had come into the city, they had waved those palm branches saying, Hosanna, this is our King. He's come to save us. He's come to deliver Israel. But now some of those same people are the ones that are in the mob. And as Pilate says, I'm not going to put him to death. He hasn't done anything wrong. The crowd just becomes absolutely furious. And the whole mob starts shouting, away with this man. Release to us Barabbas. We're told that I think it's in John, we're told that the scribes, the Pharisees, the elders actually stirred the people up to say this, so that they were literally going around whispering things like, tell him you want Barabbas instead of Jesus. That man's got to be crucified. It's better that one man die than all of us be put to death by the Romans. So the crowd's been stirred up and they don't even really know what they're doing, and they're yelling out, give us Barabbas instead of Jesus. Barabbas, verse 19, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. So they're actually saying, release a murderer, crucify the innocent man. John 18:39, Pilate says, you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. So do you want me to release the King of the Jews? Of course, he's mocking them when he says this to them. When he calls Jesus the King of the Jews, he's actually mocking the Jews. He says, don't you want me to release him? But the whole crowd begins to say, no, not this man. We want Barabbas. Barabbas was, the Bible says in John, a robber. So Barabbas is a robber. Barabbas is a murderer. Barabbas is actually guilty of the crime they're charging Jesus for, the crime of sedition, the crime of rebellion. And they all begin to cry out, we don't want Jesus. We don't want the one that's fed us. We don't want the one that has healed us. We don't want the one that has served us. Give us Barabbas, the one who killed somebody, the one who murdered somebody, the one who has robbed, the one who has stolen. We want him. Verse 20, Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus again, called out to them. Notice this, Pilate wants to let Jesus go. And he calls out to them and he starts to say something, but verse 21 said, but they shouted. So Pilate tries to say something and the mob just drowns him out, and they begin to yell, they begin to chant, crucify, crucify, crucify. Somewhere amid all this chaos, Pilate receives a message from his wife, and that message says, look, I had a dream last night about this man. He's innocent. Don't have anything to do with his death. So you've got the crowd yelling, crucify. You've got this message coming from his wife. You've got Jesus standing there before him, just a broken pile of a man. And he's hearing this mob all at the same time, crucify, crucify, crucify. And all at the same time, Pilate's just wanting to let him go. He just wants this done with. Verse 22, then he said to them a third time, why? So they're yelling out, crucify. And Pilate says, whoa, 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 whoa. Why? What evil has he done? I found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were, verse 23, they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. The end of verse 23 is really so sad. The end of verse 23 says, so they're demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. Now, as Jesus stands before Pilate, Pilate really wants to let him go. In fact, as they're crying out, crucify him, John tells us that he said, look, you take him, you crucify him. But the Jews said, we can't. We have a law, and according to our law, he's got to die because he made himself the Son of God. But we can't kill him because we don't have that right under Rome. Well, now, Herod doesn't at all believe that Jesus really is the Son of God. He doesn't have saving faith, as we've talked about often. But he is scared when he hears this man has said he's the Son of God. As a Roman, Herod would have believed in the divine becoming a human. And when he hears that Jesus has said he's the Son of God, it literally shoots fear through Herod. And Herod goes into Jesus and he says, where are you from? And Jesus didn't answer him. Then Pilate says to Jesus, look, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to put you to death? And then Jesus looked at him very seriously and he said, Pilate, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Don't you think that sent chills through Pilate's spine? He said, you have no authority over me, Pilate. You have no authority except for the authority that God has given you. Jesus said, you have no authority over me. And then the Bible tells us in John 19:12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. Now, even more, Pilate wants to let him go because he's at least afraid. Not only is this an innocent man, but this is a man that claims to be the Son of God. So from that moment on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend. If you let this man go, you're no friend of Rome, Pilate. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." You know what this is? This is cancel culture at its finest. Give us what we want, or we'll take away everything you have. Pilate, if you don't crucify Jesus, we're going to tell Caesar, and he'll take everything from you. When Pilate heard them say that, John 19 tells us he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that's called the pavement. In Hebrew, it's called Gabbatha. Now, it was the preparation day of the Passover. It's about the 6th hour, so it's 9 a.m. Pilate brings Jesus out. He brings him out before the mob. And as he brings Jesus out, and Jesus has already been mutilated, Jesus has already been torn to pieces, and as he brings him out, you would think that they would have some sympathy when they see what has been done to Jesus already. And instead of sympathy, when he brings Jesus out again, they begin to cry out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify! Crucify! Crucify!" So Pilate said to them one last time, he said, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest said this, "We have no king but Caesar." Verse 24 of our text, so Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. In other words, Pilate gave in. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. They literally, from this point, the soldiers took and they led Jesus to Golgotha. They crucified Christ. The Jews got exactly what they wanted. But I want you to think about this. They leave headed for Golgotha, and they leave Pilate sitting alone in Gabbatha at the pavement, the place where judgment was made. Now, at some point in this whole thing, Pilate had literally taken a bowl of water and he had washed his hands, and he had said, "Look, I'm innocent of this man's blood," but you and I both know he couldn't wash this off his hands. Pilate was ultimately, in one sense, responsible for this. Now, I want us to consider this one question before we leave today. Why did Pilate, if you look at Pilate in history, you see a man who otherwise has no favor for the Jews. He doesn't care what they want. In fact, he hates the Jews. He despises the Jews. He wants to take everything away from them. Why would this man who hates the Jews in that way give them what they wanted? Why would he give in to their will? Why did this stubborn ruler let the crowd force him to crucify Christ when he was convinced that Christ was innocent? Pilate knew Jesus was innocent. And he repeatedly had said, "I find no fault in him, nothing at all." He knew, according to Mark 15, verse 10, Pilate knew that the chief priest had only arrested Jesus. They only hated him. They only handed him over because they were jealous. Pilate knew that. This was all about jealousy. And after hearing the claim that he was the very Son of God, now Pilate desperately wants to release Jesus. He wants to let him go. Yet when he says, "I'm going to let him go," the crowd cries out, "Crucify, crucify, crucify." And then stubborn Pilate capitulates. Why? Why did Pilate give in to the mob? I believe it can all be summed up in just a few words. Pilate was afraid of losing his position, and rather than losing his position, he lost his soul. May I say it this way? Pilate literally offered up Jesus' life in exchange for his. If you dig a little into the historical context, it all begins to make sense. Pilate's mentor, Sejanus, who I've already mentioned, and that name will be on the test, so grain that in your mind, Sejanus. Pilate's mentor, Sejanus, had actually recently been executed. He was executed because it was discovered that he was trying to overthrow Tiberius and become Caesar himself. So now, Sejanus is not there to protect Pilate. Not only is Sejanus not there to protect Pilate, but Caesar, Tiberius, is suspicious of Pilate as well because of Pilate's connection to Sejanus. Emperor Tiberius is assistant also. Tiberius wants to keep peace with the Jews. He's not trying to stir up trouble. And having a ruler like Pilate in Judea is already problematic. With his history of violence, with his history of force, Pilate's already in a bad spot, in a bad political space here. Now the Jews hate him. The ones he's supposed to rule hate him. Tiberius is suspicious of him. And what he sees here, though, now he has Jesus standing in front of him, and he can solve all of that by just giving up Jesus. Because if he just gives up Jesus, the mob will be mollified. The mob will appreciate what he did for them. And not only will they appreciate it, but Caesar will know he honors him because he's showing that he's a friend to Caesar. Because nobody who says he's a king can really be a friend of Caesar, right? At this moment, Pilate's in a politically precarious position. And he sees this opportunity before him, the opportunity that is standing before him, an opportunity that will solve all his problems, and the opportunity is just sacrifice Jesus. If he gave them Jesus, they would be mollified, Caesar would be glorified. By giving in to the cries of the crowd, he would protect his position, he would guarantee his governorship, so he, against his better judgment, Pilate gave in, and he gave up Jesus. Pilate literally found himself stuck between the crowd and Christ, and out of fear of what people would think or what people would do if he didn't give them what they wanted, Pilate crucified Jesus. He sent him to the cross. Now get this in your mind. Pilate sent Jesus to the cross fully convinced that he had not committed a single crime. You know, it would be difficult, if I was on a jury, it would be difficult to hand down a guilty verdict if I knew the guilty verdict meant the death penalty. And not that I'm against the death penalty, it's that you're literally, that man's life is in my hands. So even if the evidence says he's guilty, I would be really hesitant to hand down that guilty verdict. But here, the man's not even guilty. The man is innocent, and Pilate lets them put him to death. Literally, Pilate offers Jesus in place of himself. Pilate, get this, Pilate was so afraid of losing control. Pilate was so afraid of losing control that he gave it away. He let the crowd make his decision regarding Christ because he really thought, if he could appease them, he could hang on to the life he loved, the power he loved, just a little bit longer. Pilate sacrificed Christ's life to save his own, and in the end, he still ended up losing it anyway. You know, Pilate didn't actually solve anything when he surrendered Jesus. He just prolonged the inevitable. It wasn't long after Christ's death, Pilate actually ended up losing all the things he was trying to protect. He was recalled to Rome on charges of cruelty, and then the rest is really mystery. We don't know what happened to Pilate. On his way to Rome, the Emperor Tiberius died, and we don't know what happened next. Some people say that Pilate committed suicide. Some people say that Pilate was exiled to somewhere in France. But what we do know is that he was trying to hold on to a life of superiority, a life of importance, and in his trying to hold on to this life of superiority, he actually died in ambiguity. Nobody knows what happened to Pilate. Pilate became a living illustration of what Jesus said in Luke 17:33. Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life will preserve it. Jesus said, whoever is willing to give up his life for me, for my sake, for the gospel, who's ever willing to take up his cross and follow me, Jesus says that man will find life, and not just life in this world, that man will find life for eternity. But he said on the flip side of that, Jesus said, anybody though who tries to save his life, anybody who tries to appease the crowd, anybody who chooses not to follow me so that everyone else won't think that they're weird, so that everyone else won't think they're crazy, everyone who tries to save his own life, in the end is going to lose his life. The application today is so simple. We cannot, please hear me if you haven't heard anything today, we cannot allow the calls of the crowd to determine what we do with Christ. We cannot allow the calls of the crowd to determine what we do with Christ. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man brings a snare. In other words, being afraid of people and what they think is a trap. The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe. Whoever disregards what men say and what they say they'll do and what they say, the actions they'll take, whoever disregards that and fears God more than he fears man, that man will be safe. But the man who fears people, the man who lets people's opinions determine his destiny, that man will fall into a trap. Friends, there is a mob demanding that we surrender our will to theirs. And you may think I'm going some sort of political direction with this or something like that, and that's not it at all. My concern this morning is not anything political. My concern is that there is a secular world out there, and they are demanding that we give up Jesus. It's old, it's outdated, it needs to be forgotten. Literally, they would be happy as they could be if we would just crucify him. Their demand is that we execute God. The call isn't just, see, you hear from the news and you hear from everyone around you. Well, the call is just accept this new morality. Do away with those old laws of God. But the reality is, the call is not just to do away with the law of God. The call is to do away with the God of the law. The call is to convict and condemn the lawgiver. The cry of the culture increases every year, and the cry is, in essence, crucify Christ and live for your own passions. And in the end, though, what matters most is what is true about Jesus. They're telling Pilate, if you don't crucify him, you're no friend of Caesar. But I want to say to you this morning, the crowd will tell you, if you live for Christ, if you follow Christ, you'll be no friend of ours. You'll have nothing. You'll be nothing. How could you follow some carpenter from Nazareth? How could you follow somebody who died and said he rose again? The crowd will say, give that up. Leave that behind. But what really matters is not what the crowd says about Christ. What really matters is what Christ has said about himself. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus really, literally died for our sins. Jesus rose again as a validation of his deity. And every man now has to decide for themselves, will they join the crowd or will they identify with Christ? Choosing the crowd over Christ is choosing temporary over eternal. Yeah, Pilate got to be the governor just a little bit longer. But Pilate didn't even realize it at the time, but he was choosing to be a governor in a fading kingdom over being a co-regent in the eternal kingdom of God. God would have gave him so much more power and so much more authority in an eternal kingdom, but Pilate was so concerned with hanging on to what he could have right in front of him. Losing everything for Christ would have been better in the end, but Pilate was blinded by the moment. Friends, eternity is too long to be short-sighted. Siding with the mob makes sense at the moment. It does. If we just do what they'll say, they'll leave us alone. But can I tell you something? It's not true. If you side with them, they'll want you to always go a step further. Say something else. Do something else. Siding with the mob will never be enough. These Jews, after he gave them Jesus, these Jews still hated him. Nothing changed. There is a mob demanding that we surrender our wills to God. They want us to execute God. And the truth is, if we do it, nothing actually changes. Siding with the mob makes sense at the moment, but what it'll produce is eternal sorrow and eternal suffering and death. However, dying with Christ will produce life without end. I know it didn't happen, but just let me borrow your imaginations for a moment. What if Pilate had have stood up and said, you know what? I think this man's innocent. And if we're going to kill him, you have to kill me too. What if Pilate had identified with Christ and identified with Christ's death rather than sacrificing Christ in his own place? Dying with Christ will produce life and life without end. I'll tell you something, to follow Christ means dying to self. It means laying down your dreams. It means laying down your ambitions. It means following Christ wholly, not just as Savior, but as Lord. Following Christ means giving everything else up. Jesus said, you cannot be my disciple. Get this. Jesus said, you cannot be my disciple unless you're willing to give everything else up. And hear that this morning. Jesus is saying that to you this morning. You cannot be my disciple unless you're willing to give everything else up, and that means the opinions and the applause of the crowd. Because if you will obey them, they'll clap for you, they'll bow before you. But if you obey Christ, if you see Christ is worth more, if you see Christ is worth giving everything else up, they will one day cry out the same as they cried out for him, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. But it is better to be crucified with Christ than to live on the throne in an earthly dying kingdom that will one day fade away. The mob is always going to demand you make sacrifices for them and for their law. Remember, they say, we have a law. The mob has a law, and they're determined that their law be carried out. They will demand that you make sacrifices for them in their law, but Christ has made a sacrifice for you according to His law. Why die for the crowd when Jesus died for you? So to the lost, I'm closing now. I just want to say, there's people here this morning, and you've been wrestling with the decision whether to follow Christ. I've watched it. I've watched how some of you are wrestling against this wholehearted going in and giving in to Christ. I've seen it. I've watched as people count the cost and they say, well, look, if following Christ means giving everything else up, I just don't know if I can give everything else up. But let me tell you something. Everything else is only an emanation. Everything else only comes from Christ. Christ is the giver. Christ is the source. Everything you give up, He can give so much more and so much better. I've seen some of you that have wrestled with the grace of God and this giving into Christ. And I just want to say to you, don't let the crowd keep you from Christ. Some of you are so afraid, if I go wholeheartedly in for Christ, what are people going to say? And can I say to you, who cares? Really, who cares? Do you realize Pilate let people he did not even like determine his eternal destiny? Pilate hated the Jews, and he let them decide where he spent eternity. The crowd is lying about Jesus, and if you're unsure, and if you really want to go all in for Christ, you're unsure about it, I want to tell you what the crowd says about Jesus, it's all a lie. He really is the Son of God, and you will find when you embrace Him that just having Him is worth everything else that you let go of. Don't let the fear of loss, don't let the fear of a lost reputation, of lost rewards, of lost gain, of lost prestige, of lost power, of lost friends, of lost whatever. Don't let the fear of loss keep you from what you will gain in having Jesus Christ. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world? What if you have everything and you lose your soul? If Jesus is God, it really doesn't matter what they demand of you. All that matters is what God demands of you. And so for those who are here this morning who are not yet in Christ, I want to say to you, don't let the crowd keep you from Christ. And then to those who are here this morning, you're believers, you're found, you're in Christ, I want to say to you, don't let the crowd keep you from Christ. The shame of His name is worth more than all they can offer. They will say, if you'll just give Him up, we'll be fine with you. Just give Him up. Have you noticed the only crime in society anymore is being a loyal Christian? That's the worst thing you can be as a Christian. The shame, though, of His name is worth more than everything they offer. Don't let Pilate wasn't a believer, but Pilate actually let the crowd. Pilate let the crowd, a group of people he didn't even like, Pilate let the crowd convince him to crucify Jesus when Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent. If you're a believer, I want to say to you, don't let the crowd cause you to deny what you know to be true about Jesus. Don't let, and to everyone here this morning, I beg you, don't let the mob make you miss the Messiah. Make no mistake, they will threaten you. If you don't, we will, ... But the fear of man is a trap. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. This is true for every person, what I'm about to say. Literally, Jesus stood before Pilate, and Pilate judged Jesus. But there is coming a very real, a very literal day in the very near future when Pilate will stand before Jesus. And I say to you this morning, those of you who are not really believers and those of you who are not trusting Christ, I say to you this morning, right now you're judging Jesus. Is He worth it? Is He what He says He is? Right now Jesus is standing before you, but there will come a day when you're going to stand before Him. The position you take there is fully dependent on the position you take here. You embrace Jesus here, Jesus will embrace you there. You reject Jesus here, Jesus will reject you there. And will say, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you. So you're faced with a question this morning. As an unbeliever, you're faced with a question. It really is Christ or the crowd. Do I want to impress them? Do I want them to be happy with me? Or do I want God to be happy with me? And as believers, you're faced with the same question, and we're going to be increasingly faced with this question of Christ or the crowd. Will I give in to their will, or will I remain faithful to the will of God? You know, again, it's sad. Pilate let people he didn't even like determine his destiny. Don't let other people determine what you do with God. Today, you must answer. Every single person here must answer this question today. What will you do with Jesus Christ? Will you embrace him as the very Son of God, or will you join the crowd in calling out, crucify, crucify, crucify? It's Christ or the crowd, never both. And today, every person here has to make a choice about that. Father, now I pray that you take